Cale had served aboard Meridian 7 for 11 years, long enough to know the difference between an ordinary shift and one that felt wrong, before anything had actually happened. That morning, standing at his console, a lukewarm cup of scent coffee in hand, he felt it settle over him like a change in air pressure, a wrongness with no name and no cause. He told himself it was nothing. He was wrong. The alert came 4 minutes into his shift. A single contact, unregistered, had emerged from the edge of the Kith corridor, a stretch of space so old and so quiet that most junior officers didn't even know its name. Cale knew it. Everyone who had studied Coalition history knew it, even if they didn't know why it mattered. The corridor was where old things wanted to be forgotten. "Contact confirmed," said Ensign Dre, her voice tightening. No transponder. No hail response. Courses steady, too steady. That was the first turning point of the morning. A ship moving with precision that no drifting wreck or damaged vessel could produce. It wasn't drifting. It wasn't lost. It was arriving. Commander Seleth arrived on the bridge within 90 seconds, still fastening her collar, her sleep-creased face sharpening into focus as she took the seat of command. "Options," she said simply. "None that makes sense," Dre replied. "It's not broadcasting. It's not evasive. It's not accelerating or decelerating to match any known approach protocol. It's just coming in, like it already knows exactly where it wants to be." Cale pulled up the trajectory. His stomach tightened as the ship's path traced itself across the display, unmarred by a single correction, a single hesitation. Whoever piloted that vessel had run this route before, or had planned it so completely that improvisation was unnecessary. Either possibility was worse than the other. "Run it against known signatures," Seleth ordered. The system searched and searched. Ship design after ship design flickered past and failed to match, each rejection appearing as a small red negation on the display, until finally the system paused. Not because it found nothing, but because it found something it wasn't supposed to look at. A restricted archive flagged the signature. Access sealed. Clearance, historical level 9. Age of record, 26 years. That was the second turning point. Nobody on the bridge had clearance for a level 9 historical file. Nobody Cale knew had ever even heard of one. "Override it," Seleth said quietly. "I'm authorizing emergency access. I want to know what that ship is before it wants to know what we are." The file unsealed with a soft chime that felt entirely too gentle for what followed. Ship class, unknown to current registries. Point of cultural origin, Terran. Status of originating civilization. Contained, presumed dispersed. File closed 26 years prior under directive classified above station command. Terran. The word passed across the bridge like a current of cold air. Cale had heard the word only in passing, in old academy lectures delivered by instructors who seemed uncomfortable even mentioning it, in footnotes about a resolved conflict that no one ever elaborated on. Humanity was a chapter closed before he'd even enrolled. A civilization that had, according to every textbook he'd ever read, simply ceased to be relevant, contained, ended, gone. "That's not possible," Dre whispered, more to herself than anyone else. They were finished 26 years ago. Everyone knows that. "Apparently," Seleth said, her voice flat with a particular calm of someone refusing to panic in front of her crew. "Not everyone." The ship crossed the final threshold into scanner range, and for the first time, its hull resolved fully on the display. Sleek, unornamented, built with an economy of design that suggested purpose over pride. And stenciled along its flank, faint but unmistakable, was a symbol none of them recognized yet, but would never forget. An open hand. Cale stared at it, feeling the third and sharpest turning point of the morning settle into his chest. This was not a wreck. This was not a refugee vessel fleeing some forgotten catastrophe. This was an announcement. Then the console chimed once more, an incoming transmission, unencrypted, unafraid, addressed to no one in particular and everyone at once. Cale's hand hovered over the console. Whatever came through that channel would either confirm the impossible or shatter 26 years of comfortable history. He looked at Seleth. She nodded once. He opened the channel. The transmission carried no static, no distortion, no sign of distance traveled. It sounded as though the speaker stood directly beside them. calm and unhurried. Each word placed with the deliberate weight of someone who had rehearsed this moment for a very long time. This is Captain Eris Voss, Terran Continuity Vessel Reckoning. We are not requesting entry. We are not requesting permission. We are here to deliver a message, and we will wait exactly as long as it takes for someone with the authority to hear it. Silence swallowed the bridge. Kale watched Selita's jaw tighten, watched the color drain slightly from Dre's face, watched every officer present recalculate everything they thought they understood about the galaxy's balance of power. Humanity was declared resolved. Sela said at last, activating a return channel, her voice steady despite everything. Contained. The file was closed 26 years ago. Files can be closed, Voss replied, and for the first time something sharpened beneath his calm, something old and patient and entirely unimpressed. Truths cannot. You closed the file. We remembered everything inside it. That was the first turning point of the encounter. The moment the Coalition's official history stopped sounding like fact and started sounding like a story someone had told themselves to feel safe. Kale pulled every fragment of the unsealed archive he could access, scanning faster than protocol technically allowed. Searching for context Sellers would need before this conversation went further than any of them were prepared for. What he found chilled him more than the ship's arrival had. Humanity, according to the earliest diplomatic notes buried in the file, had not arrived in Coalition space as conquerors or threats. They had arrived seeking partnership, trade routes, cultural exchange, a seat at a table already crowded with older, more established civilizations. And those civilizations, confident in their seniority and unsettled by how quickly humanity adapted, learned, and grew, had responded not with welcome but with restriction, quotas, travel limitations, quiet, bureaucratic containment dressed up as caution. They didn't attack first, Kale said aloud, almost without meaning to. Sela turned toward him sharply. The notes here, the earliest contact reports. Humans asked for cooperation. The restrictions came from us. That's not what the histories teach, Dre said, though her voice had lost its certainty. The histories were written by the people who imposed the restrictions, Kale replied. Before anyone could respond, the second turning point arrived without warning. A new set of contacts bloomed across the long-range scanner, faint and scattered at first, then resolving with unnerving clarity into a formation that had clearly been holding position long before the reckoning ever announced itself. "Commander," Dre said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we have more contacts. A lot more." Sela stood. "How many?" Dre's hands moved across the console, refining the count with visible reluctance, as though delaying the answer might change it. 31, she finally said. 31 additional vessels, positioned just beyond our effective scanner range. They've been there. Commander, based on thermal bleed and drift patterns, some of these ships have been sitting in that position for months. The bridge went utterly still. 31 ships, hidden not through cloaking technology or advanced stealth systems, but through nothing more than perfect discipline and patience, sitting silent at the edge of detection, waiting for exactly this moment, undetected not because the Coalition lacked the tools to find them, but because no one had ever thought to look. They didn't hide from our sensors, Kale murmured. They hid from our assumptions. Then came the third turning point, delivered again through Voss's steady voice, as the fleet's formation resolved into full view on the display, each vessel bearing the same symbol as a reckoning, the open hand, and beneath it, words that would be repeated in briefing rooms across a dozen worlds within days. "We remember," Voss said. "We came back. Count carefully." Sela stared at the formation, then at the words scrolling across her display, and Kale saw something shift behind her eyes. Not fear exactly, but the specific dread of someone realizing that a war she'd been taught was one had, in fact, never actually ended. It had simply been paused by one side, without the other side's agreement. "Open a full channel," she said quietly. "Tell them we're listening." Word of the fleet spread through Meridian 7 faster than any official channel could contain it. By the time Sela called her senior staff into the Situation Room, half the station already knew that humanity, supposedly dissolved, contained, resolved, had returned not as a scattered remnant, but as an organized, disciplined force that had clearly been preparing for this exact moment for a very long time. 32 ships, said Chief Tactical Officer Wren, pacing at the edge of the room. One flagship making contact. 31 others holding position. That's not a rescue mission. That's not even a diplomatic mission in the traditional sense. That's a demonstration. A demonstration of what? Asked Dre. Of the fact that we never actually knew where they were, Kale said, and that we still don't know how many more there might be beyond those 32. That thought landed heavily in the room, the first turning point of the gathering. If 31 ships had waited undetected for months at the edge of a single station scanner range, the possibility that this was merely a fraction of a much larger, much more patient fleet was not paranoia. It was arithmetic. Seleth laid the unsealed archive across the table's display. And for the first time, the senior staff saw the full shape of what actually happened 26 years ago. The Kate response, as it had been quietly named in classified files, had not been a war humanity started and lost. It had been a crisis born from years of accumulating restriction. Trade routes denied, technology sharing agreements blocked, human expansion capped under the justification of galactic stability. When humanity had finally pushed back against those limits, demanding renegotiation rather than continued containment, older powers within the coalition had responded with force disguised as peacekeeping. The confrontation that followed had been brief, brutal, and almost entirely one-sided in terms of information control. Humanity had not been defeated in any conventional sense. They had simply been maneuvered into an agreement, the so-called Containment Accord, that traded their silence and retreat from most coalition space for survival of their remaining worlds. And then, methodically, the historical record had been rewritten. Contain became resolved. Silence became gone. They less believed they disappeared, Wren said slowly, staring at the archive, for 26 years. Because that's exactly what we needed to believe, Kale said. A civilization that vanished doesn't need to be renegotiated with. A civilization that's still out there, still growing, still remembering everything we did. That's a problem no one in coalition leadership ever wanted to solve. The second turning point arrived when Kale pulled a set of old diplomatic field reports from the deepest layer of the archive, notes written by early coalition observers who had studied human behavior before the Containment Accord was signed. The reports described a trait that had unsettled those early diplomats more than any weapon or technology humanity possessed. Humans did not forget, not their triumphs, not their humiliations, not the smallest unkept promise or the largest betrayal. They passed memory down with the same deliberate care other species reserved for treaties and law, ensuring that no generation would ever be allowed to forget what had been taken from the one before it. They didn't just survive 26 years of silence, Kale said, reading the final line of the report aloud. They used it. Every year we assumed was a year they spent recovering, rebuilding, and teaching their children exactly what happened and exactly who was responsible. Wren exhaled slowly. That's not just patience. That's the most dangerous kind of preparation there is. Then came the third and final turning point of the gathering. A priority transmission from the Reckoning, addressed directly to Commander Seleth, requesting formal permission for a delegation to board Meridian 7. Not a fleet, not a show of force. A single shuttle, carrying representatives who wished, the message stated plainly, to speak face-to-face. Seleth read the request twice before setting it down. They could have opened fire the moment they arrived, she said. 32 ships against one aging observation station. Instead, they're asking permission to talk. That's not mercy, Kale said quietly, the realization settling into him with the weight of certainty. That's strategy. They want the record to show that they asked. They want everyone watching to know exactly who chose honesty and who chose to keep hiding. Seleth looked around the room at her staff, all of them waiting for a decision that would matter far beyond the walls of a single station. Finally, she reached for the console and authorized a request. Let them come aboard, she said. It's time we heard the truth from the people who actually lived it. The shuttle that attached from the Reckoning was smaller than Kale expected, unarmed as far as any scan could determine, and utterly unhurried in its approach. Another quiet demonstration of confidence from a people who apparently felt no need to prove anything through force. It docked exactly on schedule, to the second, as though even this moment had been rehearsed 100 times before it ever happened. Kale stood beside Seleth in the docking bay, flanked by a modest honor guard that felt, in retrospect, almost embarrassingly defensive compared to the calm with which the delegation stepped through the airlock. For humans enter Meridian 7. The first Kale had ever seen in person, and nothing like the vague, half-remembered images from old Academy texts. They moved without hesitation, scanning the bay not with fear, but with the practiced attentiveness of people cataloging details for a report they intended to write later, in full. At the front of the group walked a man who introduced himself simply as Owen Carr, representative of what he called the Terran Continuity Authority, a name none of them had ever heard, belonging to a government structure the Coalition had assumed no longer existed. "Commander Selith," he said, extending a hand in a gesture that felt deliberately, pointedly familiar, a reminder, perhaps, that some human customs had survived intact despite everything. "Thank you for allowing us aboard." "You didn't need our permission," Selith replied evenly. "Your fleet made that clear enough." "We didn't need it," Carr agreed. "We wanted it. There's a difference, and it matters to us more than you might expect." That was the first turning point of the meeting, the realization, settling over Selith and her staff in real time, that this was not a conquering force testing the limits of its power. It was a civilization deliberately choosing restraint, and doing so publicly, so that no one could later claim humanity had returned as an aggressor. They moved to the station's central conference room, where Carr and his three companions sat across from Selith, Kale, and Wren. No weapons were drawn. No threats were made. Instead, Carr opened a small data unit and slid it across the table. "Before we discuss anything else," he said, "we'd like you to see what actually happened during the Kth response. Not the version in your sealed archive, the full version. Every negotiation, every threat made against us by delegates who are, in several cases, still serving in Coalition leadership today." The second turning point arrived as the files opened, revealing recordings, transcripts, and testimony that made the sanitized archive Kale had accessed earlier look like a children's summary. Diplomats threatening to cut off medical supply routes to human colonies unless expansion demands were withdrawn. Fabricated incidents used to justify military posturing. A final ultimatum delivered not as a negotiation, but as an order. Retreat, remain silent, and disappear from Coalition records, or be erased from them by force. Wren's expression had gone rigid. "Some of these names," he said slowly, "are still active in Coalition Council records." "Yes," Carr said simply. "That's rather the point." Kale watched Selith absorb the weight of what she was seeing. The slow, visible collapse of history she had trusted her entire career, replaced by something far messier and far more damning. It would have been easy, in that moment, for her to retreat into denial, to insist the files were fabricated or manipulated. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered. "What do you actually want, Mr. Carr?" The third turning point came in his answer, delivered without anger, without triumph, without a single raised word, which somehow made it more unsettling than any threat could have been. "Acknowledgement," he said, "a public admission from Coalition leadership of what happened 26 years ago and why. Restoration of humanity's freedom to travel and trade across Coalition space without restriction. And an honest answer to a question your council has never actually had to answer before." He leaned forward slightly. "Does the Coalition believe in equality among its member species, or only in the appearance of it, so long as no one inconvenient is around to ask?" Nobody in the room spoke for a long moment. Kale realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the station's climate control, that the answer to that question would determine far more than the fate of one negotiation. It would determine whether the Coalition survived the truth it had spent 26 years burying. News of the delegation's demands did not stay contained in Meridian 7 for long. Within hours, encrypted reports began moving up the Coalition's command structure, and within a day, the first responses arrived, not from calm, measured diplomats, but from officials whose panic was audible even through formal channels. Counselor Vera Doss, one of the Coalition's most senior representatives, and, as Carr's files had revealed, one of the very diplomats who had issued the original ultimatum against humanity 26 years earlier, transmitted a direct order to Selith: deny the delegation further access, reseal the archive, and prepare Meridian 7 for reinforcement. That was the first turning point of the growing crisis. The moment became clear that at least some in Coalition leadership had no intention of confronting the truth, only of burying it more deeply than before. He wants me to arrest a peaceful delegation and pretend none of this happened, Sella said, staring at the order with open disbelief, after we've already seen the evidence ourselves. He's not thinking about evidence, Kale said. He's thinking about consequence. If this becomes public, careers end, maybe worse than careers. Sella set the order aside without acknowledging it, a small act of defiance that Kale understood carried enormous risk. Instead, she authorized a wider release of the unsealed archive to a handful of trusted contacts across other coalition worlds, journalists, historians, and independent council members known for resisting leadership's more convenient narratives. It was a calculated gamble. Once the truth began spreading beyond a single station, no order to suppress it would be fast enough to catch up. The second turning point arrived less than a day later, when Owen Carr requested a second meeting, this time bringing something Seleth hadn't expected. Testimony recordings from human colonies that had survived the containment years in near-total isolation, describing decades of quiet resilience, of children raised on stories of a homeland stripped of its voice, of communities that had rebuilt without any assistance from a coalition that had promised, in exchange for their silence, resources, and support that had simply never arrived. "You didn't just contain us," Carr said quietly, watching the recordings play across the table. "You abandoned the terms you forced on us the moment we stopped being visible enough to embarrass you." Kale watched Seleth's expression harden, not with anger at Carr, but with a slow, cold recognition of just how thoroughly her own government had betrayed the very agreement it had used to justify humanity's exile. Then came word from beyond the station itself. Other coalition worlds, upon receiving the leaked archive, had begun demanding answers of their own council representatives. Public statements grew increasingly strained. Some officials attempted outright denial, only to be met with the same recordings, the same transcripts, spreading faster than any denial could contain. The third turning point of the stretch of the crisis arrived when Counselor Doss himself, cornered by mounting public pressure and unable to suppress the spreading truth, transmitted a second message to Meridian 7. Not another order, but something far more revealing. A private, off-record plea to Seleth, asking her to help him control the narrative before it destroyed what remained of his career. "He's not asking me to protect the coalition," Seleth said, reading the message with quiet disgust. "He's asking me to protect him." She looked to Kale, to Wren, and finally, across the table, to Carr and his delegation, who waited with the same patient calm they had carried since the moment they'd first stepped aboard. "I won't do that," Seleth said, loud enough for the recording to catch it clearly. "You built this silence on a lie. Counselor, I'm not going to help you build a new one to replace it." Carr allowed himself, for the first time since arriving, something close to a small, genuine smile. "That," he said, "is the first honest answer anyone in coalition leadership has given us in 26 years. The formal hearing convened 3 days later, broadcast across every major coalition network under pressure too widespread to resist any longer. Counselor Doss and a handful of allied officials sat before an assembly forced, for the first time in a generation, to confront a history they had spent 26 years pretending didn't exist. Kale stood beside Seleth in the gallery, watching Owen Carr take his place at the center of the chamber, calm as he had been from the very first transmission aboard Meridian 7. Around the room, delegates from a dozen member worlds waited, many of them having only learned the full truth in the past 3 days, their expressions ranging from disbelief to open shame. "You were told humanity vanished," Carr began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber without need for amplification. "You were told a crisis was resolved." Both of those statements were lies, constructed by people in this room, to protect careers and comfortable arrangements built on our silence. That was the first turning point of the hearing. The moment Doss, cornered by evidence too extensive to dismiss, attempted one final defense, arguing that the original restrictions placed on humanity had been necessary for galactic stability, a painful but justified decision made for the greater good. "Stability," Carr repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Ask yourselves honestly, stability for whom? We asked for trade, for cooperation, for a seat among equals. What you built instead was a hierarchy dressed up as peace, and when we refused to accept our place at the bottom of it, you erased us from your own history rather than admit you were wrong." The second turning point arrived when Seleth herself was called to testify, an unusual step for a station commander, but one the Assembly insisted on, given her role in bringing the truth to light. She spoke plainly, without embellishment, describing the sealed archive, the fabricated resolution, and Doss's own attempt to pressure her into suppressing the delegation rather than hearing them. "I was taught that the Caith response was a conflict we won," she told the Assembly. "It wasn't a conflict we won. It was a truth we buried. And burying truths doesn't make them go away. It just means someone has to dig them up eventually, and by then, the cost of doing so is always higher than it would have been to simply be honest in the first place." A murmur moved through the chamber, not of outrage at humanity, but a slow, uncomfortable reckoning with what the coalition itself had become. The third and final turning point came not from Carr, not from Seleth, but from an unexpected voice, a junior delegate from one of the smaller member worlds, rise and ask a question that cut through decades of careful political phrasing. "If we admit this happened," she asked, "what happens next? Do we simply apologize and move on? Or do we actually change what allowed this to happen in the first place?" Carr turned to her, and for the first time since his arrival, something like genuine hope crossed his expression. "That," he said, "is exactly the right question. We're not here for an apology, though it's owed. We're here to see whether this coalition is willing to build something honest going forward. Equal access, equal voice, no quiet restrictions dressed up as caution. If the answer is yes, humanity is prepared to rejoin this coalition as a full and equal partner. If the answer is no, we've survived 26 years of silence already. We can survive being told the truth again and simply build our future without you." The vote that followed was neither unanimous nor immediate, and the road ahead, Cale understood even as the Assembly began its long, difficult deliberation, would not be short or simple. Old alliances would resist. Old lives would take years to fully unwind. Doss and others like him would face consequences that would ripple through coalition leadership for a long time to come. But standing in that gallery, watching Owen Carr's calm, unwavering patience finally meet its match in a room forced to listen, Cale understood something that would stay with him long after that day ended. Humanity's greatest strength had never been the ships waiting silently beyond the scanners, nor the weapons they never needed to fire. It had been the simple, unbreakable discipline of remembering, of refusing to let convenient lies replace inconvenient truths, no matter how long the wait for justice took. They had not disappeared. They had simply been counting, carefully, until the moment the galaxy could no longer look away. And now, at last, it was counting too.